Okay, so this session we're going to be looking at, I'm not sure how many of you guys have heard of it, systems abuse. Is anybody familiar with the term? A couple of people? So you've heard of it? Okay, you've heard of it, but you're not sure what it means. Okay, that's cool. It's an important concept for us to be aware of in community service work, all different types, whether it's disability, youth work, especially in childcare, especially in out-of-home care, elderly, whole stack. I'll start with a scenario. By a young woman by the name of Zara. She's 13 years old. She's been placed temporarily in, let's imagine you're working for a respite service. So like a foster care service, but temporary. So yeah, respite kids come to live in a respite service typically for a short period of time. And that's because in her case, there's a suspicion of sexual abuse against her. It hasn't been confirmed yet, but that's a strong suspicion. Strong enough that they'd remove her from her family. And as often enough happens, she's going to be moved on to another service or foster family after the court case, but right now, while the court's happening, it's a temporary stay for her. And the police or FACS or whatever the Child Protective Services organisation is in the state where Zara lives, because I'm keeping this broad, they'd like some further information from Zara. They want to strengthen their case against the perpetrator. So she's got a bit of pressure there to explain, to tell more, to say what's going on. Again, fairly typical story so far. There's a few other people in the respite service. It's not just Zara and you and the other workers. Everybody's temporary. They're all waiting for permanency. Another factor of the story is that the perpetrator might want to influence her testimony. So, and again, basically the perpetrator doesn't want her, getting him in trouble. So she's been removed from a school, from a youth group, because the perpetrator would know that's where to go to, that's where she could be found, that's where she could be influenced. She's been removed from her family. A lot of confusion there as to what's going on with the family. She's really not sure what her friends and family have been told. So she's out of her school, she's out of a youth group. She doesn't know what anybody's been told. We're doing what we can to reassure her that she's not the victim in this, she's not the guilty party in this, but it's difficult because people tell stories. In all of that, we can sort of see that there's going to be some difficulties for Zara. This is where the concept of systems abuse comes in. Cashmore, Dolby, Brennan, these guys studied the concept, they defined it and said systems abuse is the harm that's done to, in their case, in the studies they did, children, in the context of policies and programs which were actually designed to provide the care and protection. The children's welfare, development and security is undermined by, I'll read the whole thing, is undermined by the actions of individuals or by the lack of suitable policies, practices and procedures within systems or institutions. So it's basically the harm that's being done as a result of us trying to provide care and protection. We're trying to care for kids. I'm going to stick with kids for a while, but remember it's a bit broader than that in systems abuse. Sometimes the institutions don't work so well. Think back 100 years ago as to what child protection would have been like, and you can imagine, read Oliver Twist sometime in your spare time. Yeah, all those stories. You got it, yeah. That's right, yeah, that's right. So those old stories about kids being put into an orphanage and they were coming from a family that wasn't fantastic, but they were kind of poor, and they're put into an institution where they're being abused, they're being physically, perhaps sexually, perhaps all sorts of other stuff going on. They're having all their future and their family. You got it. Similar to our little Zara. So typically, again, the people that studied this concept said we could characterise systems of use. It involves some of the following. It involves it involves several of the following. The failure to consider what the children's needs are. The unavailability of appropriate services for children. So when the services just aren't there for what their needs are. A failure to effectively organise and coordinate good services, but they're not being coordinated properly. And institutional abuse, where there's actually maltreatment perpetrated within the agencies who have the responsibility for the care of the child. So that last one is what you were talking about, Stephanie, with the kids who were in the orphanages back in the day, is the kid actually being maltreated. But even if we've gotten away from that, even if, like, that's the easy one to spot in a lot of cases. We know that when we go out into industry, or some of you are there already, we're going to make sure that kids are fed and clothed properly. We're going to do what we can to stop them getting hurt. But looking at those first 3 points, we fit them in as best as we can with the service we've got, because that's where we work. And it's not our job to design a whole new program for this kid's particular needs. So we do what we can with what we got. Maybe there isn't appropriate services, and so we put them wherever we can. And maybe that third point there, maybe the services are there, but they're not being organised or coordinated or that well. So sometimes services, well, an example from a refuge back when I worked for them, some of them, refuges said, okay, this is a refuge that's only for school-age kids, therefore they have to be at school during the day. We might not even have staff during the day unless there's a particular reason for it. That makes sense. That means they can run their service. That works really well for a lot of the kids, except that they can't coordinate that with the school, because those of you who are parents, well, you tell me, those of you who are parents, can I just get a show of hands? So most of us. The rest of you probably had parents, so that... Okay, so think about when you're at school or when your kids are at school. How much has that interfered with your working life, or times when you needed to actually go in for meetings or to pick your kids up? Yeah, exactly. Yes, I've heard about you've already told me there's been dramas with your family. So think about that one as a classic example. A child who's had a few hassles with, I don't want to share too much, but with reading, learning difficulties. Okay, so learning difficulties and being bullied is, to put it in a nutshell. And you as a parent had to go in to resolve some issues, to take flex time off work, to do whatever you could. Okay, so here's our problem. You're a parent, you'll do anything for your kids. I know this already. Yes, because we've had chats. And workers will tend to do whatever they can for their kids too, but not to the degree that a parent would. Or rosters might not be written where the workers can do things during the day, or rosters are written with a different staff member on each evening, so the kid doesn't have that constancy and continuity. Coordinating between the school and the refuge, that's difficult. And then you start trying to fit in counselling, and you try to start fitting in other things. All these different services each do their own thing, and it gets hard. That's what we're talking about with systems of use, is on that third point there. Services might, in a magical world, all work well together, but they're mostly looking, here's what my needs are, here's what I need to do. The refuge says we need to have them out during the day. The school says we can't have this kid here during the day with all the problems she's got. The counsellor says, I will happily see the child, but somebody has to get her here. You can't just stick her in a taxi. All of those services being fitted together, that's the difficulty. The same researchers put a lot of work into this because they were trying to fix what was a fairly broken system, and they did a reasonably good job of it. It's not perfect now, but there are a lot of improvements because of the researchers. Emotional abuse through systems of use could occur because sometimes the investigation, so again, they're researching kids who come into care because it's not safe for them in their home environment. So you remember in Zara's story, the police are wanting to gather some information. They are wanting to investigate. They're wanting to stop this perpetrator from doing this ever again. That can be traumatic. There's a balance we're trying to strike there. We want the kid to be safe, but we also want other kids to be safe in future. We want to have somebody locked away, and the legal system has to get... The investigations can be traumatic. Sometimes there's emotional abuse because things I was just talking about, the out-of-home care experience. So out-of-home care is not so much homelessness. I was talking about refuges. Out-of-home care is the term we use for kids who aren't able to live with their parents, and therefore the government, the institutions, us lot, come in to try to help them. But it means, again, think about Zara, multiple placements, lack of continuity, siblings being separated. You typically have a service, especially back in those days, that said, no, we only cater to 5 to 12-year-olds. And another service that says, well, we only cater to 12 to 18-year-olds. You've got 3 or 4 siblings. They're spreading that. That means the kids are being separated, as well as being separated from their home of origin. They're not able to get that support they want from each other. That can be emotionally abusive. Sadly, the kid quite often gets removed for their own safety rather than the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator. By the time the court cases happen, which may take years, the perpetrator may well be removed, but in the meantime, we've got this emotional abuse happening. And sometimes at the end of all of that time, the abuser doesn't end up getting punished anyway because there isn't sufficient evidence. It's very hard to prove what's happened behind locked doors. And the child gets removed, so that ends up feeling like the kid... This is one of the reasons why kids, when they disclose, will retract their disclosure. So they'll say that they've been abused, but they'll pull that back again because they'll say, no, it never happened, because it feels like they're actually being punished. Because you said that thing, we're taking you away from your family. And that's what we've got. Okay, so that's the 4 points. There's also emotional abuse that is cases such as, and again, this is the same researchers, failure to protect them from further abuse. So again, this is 94, 96 that they were doing this research, but it was happening a long time before then. Especially when we were desperate to get whatever carers we could for kids. We had this situation where pretty much any worker will do if they're prepared to work for such little money and they can convince the boss that they're nice people. And they would then have 24-hour access to kids quite often on their own. So when I began work in 1987, I was given responsibility for a farm, but it had up to 10 kids. Actually, I'd started volunteering prior to that. So in 85, 86, we'd started off with 30 kids, an old mission farm. And I'd convinced people that I was a good bloke, because it didn't take much convincing, because I really was. I was doing it as a volunteer. Thank you. I said was, not am. But anyway, I was. And I was given responsibility for busloads of kids at a time to take them places, and one-on-one. So the kids are actually very vulnerable when they're just with me. I was safe, but I realised then, gee, that they took me because I was working for nothing or for very little. This would be like a honeypot to all of those people that want to perpetrate vulnerable kids, perpetrate abuse, so people that want to sexually abuse kids, or physically abuse, or any other sort of abuse. Yeah, sorry, I'm emphasising sexual abuse here. Physical abuse was kind of accepted. They stopped, I think it was about 1980 that they, or in the early 80s, that they finally ruled out corporal punishment in schools. You could still get the cane. Yeah, some of you here got the cane back then. Yes, more than once. But yeah, but that was the thing, is you'd get the cane. So that was accepted even in the school settings. So for parents to do it at home, socially acceptable. Put it into a case where it is institutionalised, it was still happening more and more, and people would always come out with the, how else are we supposed to teach them anything if we can't hit them now and then, they're little shits. With that, keep in mind the other lessons you're doing about burnout, where people are losing their patience and losing their shit because they're under so much pressure. There's further abuse that happens physically as well as sexually. I've already talked emotionally. I've sort of touched on already, but child witnesses in the court system, I think we do quite a good job now of saying, how do we protect kids in the court system? They're actually giving their testimony via camera, so they're not sitting in the room, this big, daunting, polished wood room with lots of procedure, with the perpetrator sitting across the room looking at them. They now give their evidence in a separate room where they're made to be safe. The questions can be sent to them via camera to and from the courtroom, but they are allowed to be kept safe that way. And finally, the family court system. So that's where we're talking access and custody. That's not the other courts. We're talking about abuse and criminal acts. Here we're talking about when families are separating, who gets custody. Children can be quite poorly emotionally abused through all of that. So yeah, quite a number of different things there that are built into the system if we don't take active measures to prevent. So let's take a little look again at our story with Zara. Let's just put that aside and remember she's there, and remember those different aspects of who Zara is. Can you think of any systems abuse concerns? I've already touched on a few. So starting with the first point. Well done. Suspicion of sexual abuse against her. She was removed. The perpetrator wasn't. She's already being hurt for being a victim. So if you've been hurt, we're going to hurt you some more. We didn't do it deliberately, but that's what the system did. What about that second point? Yeah, the second point and in fact the fourth point are both about that lack of permanency, thank you. A lack of permanency, a lack of continuity. You've been taken away from all the stability you had and you can't be put into a new place of consistency. What about that third point? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's difficult. It's hard. This is all hard work, but the police don't want the evidence to be destroyed. They do want to ask some quite personal and intimate questions. So a young person that I have contact with who was sexually abused, so we'll keep using that, similar to Zara, she gave her evidence, she gave her testimony. It was all recorded, she was questioned, she had all the supports necessary there to help her get through it and to help her tell her story. And then 18, I think it's about 24, I think it's a full 2 years later, the court case actually came up and they had to give her the recordings to say, okay, this is what your testimony was. Do you still stand by everything you had to say? We won't make you repeat everything that you said, but we might have some questions, so you'll still need to appear at court. So in contrast to what I just said, the abusive nature of this was she had to find somebody and this is kind of where I came in, who she knew and trusted and she could talk about this sort of thing, keeping in mind that other witnesses couldn't be it. So basically they gave her the recordings and said, you need to listen to this. And it was a good 4 hours worth of recordings, much of which was her bawling her eyes out, trying to tell this story. She's having to relive this 2 years later. So 4 years after the abuse, 2 years after having made the statement, she's having to listen to these recordings of herself being interrogated, being questioned and crying. And yeah, that was an entire day of somebody she knew. It wasn't actually me, but it was somebody I know. Spent the day listening to these recordings with her so that she could be familiar and say, yes, that's what I believed, and be ready to have questions fired at her the next day. So the police have a difficult job. I would quite like it if court cases were all resolved within a month of the crime being made aware, the police being made of the crime, but it's not how it happens. So that's the third point there. What about, we talked to the first, second, third, fourth points. The alleged perpetrator might want to influence her testimony, so she's been removed from her school, her youth group, she's been removed from her family, and she's not sure what her friends and family have been told. So some people would always see her as this tainted, there's the girl that was raped, there's the girl that had sex when she was under 12. And yeah, there's cruel, but that's the picture that people have in their minds. So just not knowing what people thought and thought of her, all those immediately around her were very supportive, but there was that difficulty. Lots of systems abuse there, as well as the abuse that happened in the first place. There's our definition again: harm done in the context of the policies and the programs designed to provide care and protection. Their security, their development, their welfare was undermined by the system itself. So I want you to take 5 minutes, think about ways that we could prevent systems abuse in Zara's case. So, well, I've told you about someone who's similar but not Zara. Zara is a made-up conglomeration of half a dozen people I've worked with over the years. I want you to think about that for 5 minutes. I want you to think about how you could keep her right to safety happening and any other ideas, and think of it beyond. Once you've sorted through that, think about other ideas for preventing systems abuse for someone who's not 13-year-old Zara but is perhaps disabled adults, perhaps people who weren't sexually abused but are still removed, perhaps males, perhaps people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, maybe Aboriginal people, thinking about of history, family histories there. I'll give you 5 minutes. Write it down, what the issues are, and writing down, thinking about possible ways that you could prevent that abuse from happening. Go for it, people.